So yes, nice to be here with you all. I wonder if this talk will be something a little bit different from what you might have encountered in design so far. It's my first time speaking with design students, but I care about design in the sense of what do we build in the world and what are we doing in the world. It seems pretty important, right? So my name's Tim, I'm a philosopher. I am not part of any university currently. I have been part of universities in the past as a student. I've been kind of interested in really what we can design that maintains a lot of the virtue and the value of a university, but is also a little bit closer to the ground. Not to replace it, but I'm certainly interested in what is it to gather together and to understand who we are, the nature of the world, and to build in it in a way that can bring us into closer touch with the patterns that comprise us. The title of this unit is Designing with the Earth. And so what is it to come into touch with that? This is a little bit about what we'll be exploring together. And we've got an hour and a half, so there's quite a bit of time. And the way I'm sort of planning out a little bit is to do a bit of an intro, go through some theory, and maybe make a few sort of practical suggestions, let's say, about how I have learned some of the structures of transformational practice. Because I think that's what we are considering if we talk about what the title of this session is, which is Philosophy for Visionary Design. So we're going to try and understand what that means. And then we'll try and wrap it up a little bit at the end, and then we'll leave plenty of time, if you'd like, to have a bit of a dialogue and interact together, and we can double-click on some things here and there. There might be quite a lot of terms some of you aren't familiar with that I mention. I'll try and express them well, but the key thing here is not to get stuck on any particular one. The hope is that in this time together, we can feel into the deeper flow of the ideas, and get a feeling of the deeper patterns that we're actually living out right now with each other. And we'll try and bring them together as we go. If you want to keep one thing in mind, one of the things I'll be orienting this talk around is something like, what does it mean to engage in loving construction? Okay, and we'll see how we can figure our way through that. Okay, yeah.
Do you mind being interrupted?
Yes, I don't mind. I think maybe particularly for the first 20 minutes, we'll see if we can get through some initial things, and then we can break into a natural back and forth. But if there's something which is like, you know, we're just on different planets here, then absolutely. But we'll see how we do for the first 20 minutes or so, and then we can absolutely have a dialogue. That would be awesome. Yeah, awesome, Ben. Okay. So, philosophy for visionary design. Sounds like a good thing to understand, right? We want to design, we want to think about how we can do so in ways that are visionary. That sounds sort of interesting. What do we mean by philosophy? We could spend the whole unit on this, and we'd really just be beginning. There's so many ways to bite into what this means. I think for our purposes, and we'll return to this, we can just think about philosophy as a deep care for the process of understanding. What else can we think about it as? An active process, an active inquiry, and something embodied. So really realizing ourselves as here in the world, engaged in understanding. Comes from words which mean in the Greek love of wisdom. And wisdom is a very difficult word to figure out, really, because context is always shifting, and what is wise one day might not be wise the next. So, visionary design. What does it mean to have vision? There's a way of thinking about this that I quite like. I came across this particular articulation from a philosopher named Forrest Landry, It's got many, many really tight articulations. He speaks about vision as what it is to see potential, whereas sight might be something like to see the actual, vision to have clarity in recognizing what the potentials are. So we're working with potential. But in thinking about design, there's many ways we can understand this word. Etymologically, in terms of where the word comes from in the history of language, at least one of the interpretations that we'll be focusing on is design as an intention towards an action. We can think about it as an intention towards constructing something in this case, right? So in thinking about the philosophy of visionary design, philosophy for visionary design is a way of coming into a deep kind of paying attention with the potentials of what we can intend to build, okay? Which is about as broad as it gets in some sense. And so there are some key questions that I imagine are with us all the time, certainly with us today and with us over the course of the unit, is what do we want to build? What do we care about? What do we desire to do? This brings in ourselves, and this brings in what we care about. All of a sudden, design now is necessarily an active process of self-understanding, in some sense, a kind of affirmation of what it is we care about. And so that too is a very big process. So that's perhaps a decent crack at what these words can mean. I mentioned talking about perhaps some theory. So there's so many ways that we could lay out the story of what I'm about to tell. I thought it might be interesting, for the sake of our gathering here, to think about the history of ideas a little bit, history of the development of culture, society, art, these types of things. And because there's so many ways to bite into all of that, I want to kind of draw it together by considering the notion of a metaphysical era. We can think about that as a certain duration in time, but there's a challenge with this, because I'm also inviting us to consider these durations in time as not linear, meaning they follow each other step by step. Once you take up the next step, forget about the last one. It's not kind of like that. These eras, I invite you to see them as sort of living weaves, in that sense, a tapestry that continues to unfold and emerge. And so I thought it might be nice to think about visionary design in the context of this kind of history, bring us up to the here and now. And so there's 4 terms, you might have come across them before. One is the pre-modern, another is the modern, then the postmodern, and the 4th, which is a bit newer, is the metamodern. Don't know if any of you guys have heard of some of these terms before. Okay. So I know there's a lot of different terminology here. It's not necessary to remember exactly what each of these terms mean, but as I mentioned at the beginning, one of the key things I hope can draw this together is this notion of loving construction. That's where we want to get to. We want to try and get to understand what that means for us to engage in it. So there's no pressure on needing to recall each one of these terms. But I also need to express what a metaphysical era might be. What do we mean by metaphysics? Because that's how I'm articulating these periods in history, right? So when we think about metaphysics, at least in much of philosophy, we think about questions about the nature of existence, what exists, what is, how do we know about it, how can we know what is, and then the third one is what do we value? It's our process of valuation, to try and understand the process of valuation itself. Remember, we're kind of asking, what do we care about? What do we desire? And we know, all of us, when we take a brief look at history, how much it seems as though what human beings have desired has at least realized a different kind of form. Of course, there are many deep continuities, but so much variance in culture as well, so many ways it expresses itself. So, this is a very deep way of understanding what comprises the identity of an era and how intelligence, as expressed in human beings, are understanding. So we can begin with the pre-modern, which is a bit of a funny one. It's a very Western way of referring to such a broad thing, because the easiest way to understand the pre-modern is that it was what, in some sense, modernism was reacting to, which basically means essentially everything before 1500s, 1600s, 1700s, right? So we're talking about an immense amount of history, and so already it's a bit ridiculous, because how many empires, different religions, different ways identity is in relation, different cultures with little or no contact at all. You have maybe animism in one part of the world, where animism might be a way of relating to the cosmos that recognize the spirit in all things, the spirit of the river, the spirit of the animals. It just is. It's just given. There's a connectedness there. And we can think about perhaps the Christian, high medieval Christianity as a very different worldview. But one thing we could argue, at least, it has in common is there's a certain givenness to it. Things just are the way they are. There is heaven, there is hell, depending on what you think about that. Right? There is this sometimes forsaken world, but there is God, there is this other place. Or perhaps at least there is just this stable divine order, and we all know who we are in relation to that. You have the divine right of kings, you have God more or less just given. Yeah. And so, in that sense, the progression of the question throughout history, you could see it in a way as being slow to take off. That itself is just a bit of a story, because of course we have so many rich parts of history, right, where the question very much is alive and we have different bodies of knowledge and all the rest of it. But nevertheless, one of the key distinctions between the pre-modern and the modern is that as we move into modernism, we think about figures like Copernicus. All of a sudden now, we no longer think that the Earth is the center of the universe. In fact, the Earth revolves around the sun. We think about Newton chucking some apples around, right, developing a kind of reasoned empiricism. And the connection here is that in the modernist period, the individual is deemed to have a kind of access and capacity to relate with truth. We can investigate the world ourselves. There is a faculty we have. We no longer need to blindly trust the authority of the previous symbolic order. Maybe it's not just the way it was all laid out. This is incredibly disruptive, obviously, disruptive to political systems. We can think about, as well, it's quite interesting. I was reading a book by David Graeber and David Wengrow, and they're anthropologists. And one of the early arguments they make was that the notion of human rights, what we began to see in the Enlightenment as this insistence that there was a particular kind of value the individual has, was deeply informed by contact with Native American tribes, which wasn't part of the history that was told too much over the last sort of 100 years or so. But it's kind of interesting, this connection, because perhaps it is because of this development of and support for inquiry that individuals can make into the nature of the world, that all of a sudden now, when dialogue opens up with the new world and the deeply old world, now there is room for at least some sort of engagement with how we could see ourselves a little bit differently. So these are some things we can say about the pre-modern into the modern. And we have this term, the Enlightenment, as broadly speaking, we think about science and reason, we think about the Enlightenment. Of course, there was an enlightenment in the sense of the Buddha becoming enlightened and what have you, 1,600 years before then. We don't talk about that one, right? Now, we want to move on to talking about the postmodern. That's our next term. And so we're moving here throughout a sort of 300-400 year period. And perhaps the story we can tell is that there's something about the nature of how it is that the individual, how people were really treated in this age that didn't quite add up, didn't quite fulfill the promise of this democratized, better way, we could say. That there's, in some important sense, a deep kind of shadow and kind of contradictions in the substructure of it, or maybe even on the face of it. And so we have critiques by people like Marx of capitalism, of the exploitation of workers, these types of things. We have so many wars, right, all throughout this period. We have two awful wars, obviously, in the early 20th century. And we begin to have this movement in reaction to modernism, which begins to question some of the foundations that are taken forward by this modernist era, that begin to question whether or not it is possible for human beings to be in relationship with truth, whether it's possible to have a truthful inquiry into the nature of what is. Because when we look at it, we can see that people arrange themselves into a certain kind of hierarchy and what we can call then that discourse society or communication context, that seeking to get at the truth, has a whole bunch of the very same all too human games of power and status, which can deeply influence whether or not it's possible to actually engage in a fair truth-seeking process. That's one sort of critique. The postmodern sort of attitude is one that recognizes the absurdities in things. It's right, it's famously incredulous towards meta-narratives or grand narratives or these big picture views of truth, that there can be grounded a way of knowing absolute patterns of intelligibility. We want to say something like this. It's very, very cynical. There's value in the critique for many reasons. But the way it seems to me is that there's something important about recognizing when something sounds a bit absurd. Interesting, the etymology of absurd means something like out of tune. It comes from a word that meant out of tune. What seems to be the case with the postmodern era is that there is not, given in its attitude, given in its metaphysics, a way to come back into tune, a way to come back into participation with these deep patterns of intelligibility. There might be a longing for, somewhere deep in the psyche, a longing for a return to what might have been more abundant in the pre-modern world, a kind of givenness and a fittedness, a connectedness. But we're so now skeptical of how we can actually understand that and ground that it becomes very difficult to convince ourselves of it. And so we can have a kind of spiraling cynicism. Think about nihilism and these kinds of things, right? And there's so much more we can say about all of this. I just want to tell a bit of a story taking us through history. Because at least what I would propose as some further research we could do, and I certainly invite you to, is to consider what we might mean by the metamodern. This wasn't a term that I came to in my sort of educational journey exactly, but I did find it, and I did find many people who are gathering in relation to it, because I was interested in, well, what is it to engage in loving construction? Because we could think about postmodernism as a deconstruction, always skeptical, right? But it wasn't enough. And so what do we mean by the metamodern? I think it's reasonable to think about visionary design today within the context of metamodernism. But for sure, I invite this as a wrestle, and there's many other ways, many other terms, many other angles we could use to get into this. What does it mean to do visionary design? So what do we mean by metamodernism? Well, I've already spoken about it a little bit. I think a good approximation is that it's a care about what is it to engage in loving construction. That doesn't negate, doesn't entirely discard the value of the critiques of the previous ages, right? So it's not a return to a kind of naivety, but it is a kind of remembrance of the value of previous eras, right? So in the case of the pre-modern, well, there's a few ways to get at this. What does it mean to recapture? What does it mean to re-sense, re-feel into what it's like to be connected in a kind of context of belonging in the cosmos? This would be a beautiful thing, to create contexts in which people can feel that, can touch that again. Now, there's ways we can approach this at the individual level. In a very real sense, in the here and now, we can recognize that we are exchanging in communication. We are creating intelligibility here, in the very exchange, in the very touch, in that sense. We don't need to be lost in history, this era, that era, this era, that there is contact. We can be in contact. We can build understanding together. And so, notions of the sacred, of the divine, all these types of things, it does seem to me to be the case that it's not even so much of a recapturing, simply a reattunement is possible. In the breath, in slowing down, in attending to the nature of awareness, our being here, that perhaps we never lost anything at all. Now, lots of things did change. The world still is what it is. And we're talking here, when we're talking about design, we're talking about an intrapsychic process in a sense of self-knowledge and understanding the nature of our desire and what we want to build. But we are also speaking about meeting the world in the context of the here and now and proposing something to build, designing something, right? So we do want to come back to the practical a little bit, a lot. What else can we say about metamodernism? Well, one thing that's said in the discourse around it is that the sentiment, the attitude, you get this in an author like Hansi Freinacht, is this relationship between sincerity and irony. So where perhaps in the postmodern you have this cynicism, maybe a lot of the ironic, right, the recognition of the absurd, the metamodernism is seeking a kind of balance, this relationship between sincerity and irony, right? That we know there might be many injustices in the nature of hierarchy as instantiated in many aspects of life. And we want to be critical of that, we want to critique those, but we don't want to throw them out altogether, right? They're not all dominators, not all dominator hierarchies. Maybe some hierarchies support growth, right? There is an appropriate transmission of knowledge that can afford the development of people. Okay, so we can step back into the sincerity of proposing ways to build in the world that observe this. So, where next then? Well, You might have heard of these terms before. They're much more common. Terms like utopia and dystopia. So we can talk about those a little bit. I want to propose a couple others. It's e-utopia. It's utopia but with an E on the beginning. And then there's also protopia. So interesting, the history of utopia, it's, everybody's like, well, no, I'm not actually a utopian. I don't believe it's possible to have a perfect and complete picture of things. Well, that's about right in terms of what the word was coined in the 1500s. It means no place. It means no place. With an E on the beginning, and both of these are influenced by the Greek, e-utopia means the good place. We think about dystopia. Well, we've all seen many movies, right? Many movies that paint dark projections forward for the future of humanity. We can think about a dystopia in some sense, I think, as a kind of where a sort of a deep absurdity is baked in to that context of the world. Something like if there was some food on the table in a dystopian world, there would always be a taste of ash. Something missing, something at some fundamental level. It's not quite right. And there's something more to this life. We're missing something important, and so we're worried about those. Don't necessarily propose dystopias, right? We think about authoritarian regimes and what have you. A dystopia, we might think about it perhaps technically as something which leaves out of the picture some core value, rather than being able to harmonize or balance or integrate a plurality of values that are important to human beings, to life process, to ecology. It is ignorant of them or actively pits itself against them to maybe support one power context over another. And so we have a deep kind of absurdity there. Now, protopia is perhaps what we can think about a little bit more in this metamodern context. Protopia is something we can think about as, well, just trying to do something that improves things just a little bit, right? So rather than being lost necessarily in some desire to bring about a final and complete perfection, can we meet this context of now, create something in it that is a humble effort at improvement, but nevertheless engaging in creation. Yeah? So these are some terms. Now there's one final one that I think is important here. You may have come across this before. If you haven't, certainly worth paying a lot of attention to, and that's the notion of ontological design. Ontological design. So this is a term I believe was coined perhaps in the early 80s. It was taken on by a guy called Arturo Escobar, and recently a man named Daniel Fraga has written a book called Ontological Design. And the core idea of ontological design, and we didn't mention this word earlier, but it was tied up with when we spoke about the metaphysical eras. So ontology in the context of metaphysics is concerned with what exists. So there's a sense in ontological design where all of a sudden reckoning with the reality that we are creating, we are bringing things into existence that have a certain effect. Now the core idea of ontological design is that what we design designs us in return. We think about mobile phones, think about cars, any number of creations, right? What we build into the world affects the conditions in which we live, conditions the nature of our psyche, creates a feedback effect, which then changes the nature of what we are, because we are, in part, that which is already conditioned by our environment. So if we want to duck into the world of a bit of philosophy again, or in at least the history of philosophy, you might have heard of a man named Heidegger, German philosopher in the 20th century. He had this concept of Dasein. Core Heideggerian concept means roughly something like being in the world, their being in the world. And what he's doing is pointing out, now what we've just said is that the subject, being, always finds itself in the world is always conditioned by patterns in the world, conditioned by the tools it uses, conditioned by its context. So when we're designing, we're affecting context, the context affects us. In this way, design has to be seen as deeply transdisciplinary. Why? Well, many reasons. One is that we began by thinking about asking the question, what do we want to build? What do we care about? What do we desire? Because we've just said that when we build something, it in turn has an effect on us. So what do we want to build? Well, where does that come from? It's not a blank slate. Now we can think about it in the context of evolution. We can think about it in the context of culture, psychology, dreams. I have a lot of interest in depth psychology, the work of Carl Jung. This type of thing is understanding the nature of the psyche. What patterns are we playing out unconsciously? So a profound inquiry of self-understanding. Why? Philosophy for visionary design. As well as, of course, an understanding of culture and art and all these different things. But as well, the necessities of living in the modern world. Right? What infrastructure is crucial? What are our needs? What is the nature of desire? Nature of wanting? These types of things. So that's the invitation. The invitation is for us to wrestle as philosophers with this question as well, at least if philosophy means something like engaging in a process of self-understanding and exchanging in that process, developing friendship in relation. Okay? So this is some of the theory component. We've covered quite a lot of terms. We've taken a bit of a tour through history that we could tell in a different way, and we don't want to hold that too fixed, okay? But if we recap it a little bit, we have a very rough story of much of the pre-modern world, although so variously construed, there's a certain givenness, a certain connectedness. That's the story that's told. The modernist reaction to that is like, oh, we're not buying that. Hang on a second, we need to be in relationship to the truth-making process a little bit more, because some of these assumptions we can now see, they're not working for us. Doesn't seem that way. We don't like that. Individual can come into the center a little bit more. Individual comes too much into the center, takes itself to be the arbiter in some sense of all things. That's maybe a little bit harsh. The postmodern's like, well, hang on a second, the individual's embedded in these various power structures, there's a certain relativity to things, we're not very certain about how this whole epistemic process you got going on here. We're skeptical of the big picture, absolute truth, we're not having it, it's all kind of bullshit. But we don't have too much to offer in terms of how to build the picture up again. And so we meet this next context. And some people in the academic, social context look at that with the term metamodernism. That's not how I came to it. We don't need to get stuck there. But I do think there's value in engaging in that context. You also have the integral theorists, and there's many different other approaches we can take. But how do we engage in the loving construction again? What is it to create context in which people can come into processes of knowing themselves, knowing each other, coming into deeper connection with the world, so that we can begin to relate to the broad patterns that comprise us and comprise what's taking place in our context of now? And how can we step forward as influence? How can we affirm our influence? There is no not being influential in this sense. Not if we take ontological design seriously. We're designed by others in that sense, or we take on the mantelpiece of building in this world as well. Can we do that with humility? What can we look to in the pre-modern context? Perhaps indigenous notions of what it is to be custodians. And this is a beautiful one. There's much to explore there in terms of what it is to come into deeper relationships with ecology, the broad patterns of life and death that we're a part of. I know that in this unit, one of the things that will be explored is donut economics. I think, at least from my perspective, a very basic way of understanding that is that we have a care about what the carrying capacity of spaceship Earth is. That's what Buckminster Fuller spoke to about, is this notion of planetary boundaries a little bit. What can the Earth actually support? What can ecology support in a regenerative sense? But it also asks us to consider, well, actually, what are the fundamental human needs? And then is there a zone where thriving is possible within the context of planetary boundaries? And so this is a little bit of a philosophical approach to some of the questions I think you guys will be taking on. I have thought about some practical things that might be interesting to consider as well, so we can take a little bit of a break from that. I do have an intention here, and so I think perhaps we could become aware of something in the space, right? Which is that on the one hand, I'm here because I'm interested to share some ways we can all relate to these questions together. But I'm here myself necessarily as a kind of influence. I have a position in this, I care about building in the world. I have certain commitments and dedications, explorations in relation to that. And so you have to wrestle with me and where I'm about to bring this into and what I'm about to sort of begin to put forward. I think these are interesting ideas. I think these are good ideas. I'm committed to them in my life in many respects. And so we have to recognize here that I'm not some authority above that's saying how it is, right? I'm putting something forward, and then we can wrestle with it together. We can speak about it. We can dialogue in relation. But I am also trying to give some things that we can all sort of look at a little bit, and in that sense, they can be some sort of objective bearing. Try to provide some sort of story to give us a bit of a bearing. And so along with this notion of loving construction, what I also want to get to is to really bring into question what communication means, what it is to communicate. Because I think this is crucial in considering philosophy for visionary design, right? Communication. We'll see if we can get there, but I want to like maybe step foot off the gas a little bit and to just offer some sort of practical things I've noticed about designing spaces, particularly in the context of communication, particularly in the context of what the process of participating in transformation is from a sort of structural design perspective. If we think about a kind of festival, that's a really awesome thing to be a part of, right? We think about a few different things. On a podcast that I recorded, I spoke to a philosopher named Alexander Bard, and he put these thoughts into a triple, which I quite liked. We're certainly thinking this way, but the words are very tight when held together, and those words are intention, ceremony, and integration. Intention, ceremony, and integration. Now, in some two basic sense, we can think about those as beginning, middle, and end, but it's not quite, right? Because this is an ongoing process, and integration means, in many respects, a return, a return to life, right? This is not a final process. So, intention, ceremony, integration. How could we think about these notions in the context of designing? Well, I think it's interesting when there is a shared experience that is something like a warm-up, which can help to engender, sort of co-develop a sense of identity, a kind of commonality of intention, a commonality of purpose for entering experience together. We know what it's like to enter a context where, well, for instance, we can take, we all more or less knew how to behave here when we came into the space, right? Because the chairs are put forward in a certain way. This is part of a program. There's students. There's something like teachers. But it can be quite chaotic when we go into a space and maybe someone's organized it, but no one's quite sure what's going on there, and then it's kind of milling about. Well, it's kind of interesting in our moment of culture today because what have been called third spaces, or places, let's say, away from home and away from work, where it's possible to gather, have sort of been dwindling. Obviously, there used to be quite a lot of church attendance. People still go to sports and what have you. But third spaces for really meeting and connecting, building real relationships, think it's fair to say that these things have been decreasing as we've become progressively more atomized, progressively more on our phones and what have you. Maybe there are third spaces online. This is an interesting one. We certainly have to relate to technology when we're thinking about visionary design. And if you want to double back, we could have actually told this whole story of today from the perspective of the development of technology and the changes in the media which we use to communicate. You know, modernism arguably would not have been possible without the development of something like the printing press, more literacy rates, right? The psychotechnologies of reading and writing becoming more ubiquitous, and now messages being able to shared more easily. It's possible to democratize in that sense and get to the individual. Now, of course, here we are in the digital age, right on this cusp, perhaps over the crest a little bit of relating with AI and what have you. And so we do need to be thinking about these things. What does it mean to design in an era in which an embodied relationship with the digital is something I think in a deep sense we're seeking? This is perhaps a bit of a tangent. We come back to intention, ceremony, integration. What is it to develop a sense of commonality, of identity when entering a space? And then how do we think about a sort of climax of participation? Again, well, this is in some sense the meat of what we're interested in. What is it human beings like to do? Like, who are we? What do we desire? What do we care about? Well, a number of things, right? We can't really think about visionary design unless we're also thinking about human beings as deeply sexual creatures. Yeah? And we can think about sexuality in a number of ways. We can think about it in a removed sense, in terms of a desire for a kind of transcendence. Having children, from the evolutionary perspective, is, in some sense like a furthering of one's line. Maybe the father dies, but the daughter lives on. And so in that sense, we participate in this kind of relationship between death here and continuity there. It's kind of a movement into the new, and the children take that on. And there's so much we could explore here in terms of the phenomenology of what it is to seek connection, of what it is to seek unity, of what it is perhaps to be of a kind of unity. I think it's fair to say that, certainly it seems to me to be the case, that is and it, the nature of what is and that we can know as it, are inseparable in an important sense. We can talk about distinctions between them, but this seems to be a deep thread of commonality among traditions East and West. When we think about mysticism, when we think about a very deep sense of what it is to be, we are in some important sense connected. But it seems to me we're also involved in processes of disconnection, all right? Things falling apart, coming back together, and never quite the same way. There's a phrase here, something like, well, things do not repeat, but they do rhyme. Something like this. So when we think about unity, when we think about connection, I tend to think in terms of whole making, what it is to participate in making whole as an ongoing process. And this does mean something like a coming into awareness of deep patterns of communication and intelligibility, right? We can think about this in terms of the level of design, maybe. The carrying capacity of the earth, as we've mentioned. We want to think about energy. We want to think about climate. We want to think about how we correlate and cohabit with the many microorganisms and different creatures and beings across the full web of life and death, which make possible the stability of our kind of relating, right? Things are all interpenetrating. There's this term that a Buddhist monk has. It's become quite popular in many circles. His name is Thich Nhat Hanh, and the term is interbeing. So when we think about these metaphysical eras, this pre-modern, modern, there's an interbeing between them. We are of those weaves. So we think about intention, ceremony, integration. There's something very important here about coming into relationship with something beyond ourselves, a kind of greater than. It might be happening right now. If something is meaningful, one way, so many ways we can understand meaning. We can understand it as a relationship between values and our purpose, or what we care about and what we're actually doing in the world. We can also think about it, maybe from a slightly more cognitive science-informed perspective, as a breaking and a remaking of frames. Frames of how we see the world, our lenses of perception, frameworks for how we view things, how we're ordering them. Of course, if we just break our frames without coming to some coherence about how next to operate in the world or anticipate what's going on, it's going to be chaotic. But if we can stay in the process and realize a relationship to some new mode or some updated mode, there's a really nice phrase in integral theory, which perhaps you might not have come across, but is again worth noting down if you want to take an investigation here into a very rich world, is transcend and include. We move beyond the current, but to include what was valuable about the previous frame, right? We're updating how we're seeing the world. And there might be some friction, there might be some chaos in between there. But if we can return, right, build connection, build trust, stay in the process, can we begin to see more? Can we connect with more? So this largely seems, there's quite a bit in the atmosphere between us now that I think is helpful for understanding what it is that people are seeking, perhaps when they go to, let's say, a transformative festival. And they seek education for many other reasons, right, as well. Might want to develop skill sets that can already conceivably develop them with a career in the current world. Things are accelerating so much that maybe a lot of what our parents have to teach us is not going to be enough to get us where we need to go because of how much things are changing. And so I do think we are what has been called by a philosopher of education named Zach Stein a time between worlds, a liminal period, where we're not actually sure how, the best ways to relate with the future in terms of what those structures will be. But can we develop a capacity to participate in transformation? Can we create contexts in which people can come together and connect that bit more deeply with the nature of what they are and the patterns they participate in? Perhaps it means a place can help to educate about the ecological patterns in a space. Perhaps there's something about the nature of geometry that can reveal a beautiful way to encounter each other. For instance, sitting in a circle is preferable for a group conversation if you want everybody to feel included. If you do it in a square, what I've found is that the people on the corners, they can sometimes feel a bit isolated, right? And that's how basic is that? Most basic thing in the world. There does seem to be something about the intelligible patterns of nature which can be deeply influential on what it is for us to come into more effective ways to communicate with each other. And these most simple affordances, in that sense, can have the most profound impact. And yet when we look around, we see a lot of boxes, and we see a lot of environments that don't seem to bring the best out of us. And so for all of this sort of lofty language in some sense, I don't want it to get lost in theory. For me, this is deeply practical, because what it is to engage in this kind of contemplation, what it is to reckon with the reality of our being in the here and now, is deeply practical. We want to develop a capacity to discern what potentials are worthwhile to bring in, to make actual. Okay. So there's a number of things to say here. We could go on, but that is quite a bit. How long have we been going for? We've been going for quite a while. We're going for quite a while indeed. Okay. Well, I really appreciate you all paying attention. I felt that for the most part we were together. I know there were some times when it was maybe needed to take a step back, take a step away. That was quite a lot. We covered a lot, but the intention was to play enough notes that maybe if some resonate, this could offer us perhaps hopefully an inspiring way, but a challenging way to really relate with the question of what visionary design means now. What is it to engage in loving construction? We haven't really spoken too much about that. Love is a fascinating thing. All I'll say is that for me, I have not found another word that is quite so good as love at referencing that which, on the one hand, holds tighter than anything else, and on the other hand, can let go and must let go. There's a paradox there, the holding and letting go. So when we think about loving construction, we're very much thinking about building in the context of dissolution. We're not seeking the final fixed perfect. It's not utopian in that sense, but nevertheless it affirms an orientation. And for me, I think a great calling in our time is how can we build context that can help us communicate, help us come into relationship with the deep patterns of intelligibility that are always already in and around us. Can we create contexts in which people are capable of sharing what matters to them? Can we meet them in that process? Can we build patterns of meaning out of that? Can we relate with the ecology that we're a part of in relation? Can we build structures that honor that relationship between psyche, culture, and nature? Because to engage in visionary design is to relate with psyche, culture, and nature. The broad patterns of life and death of the ecology we're a part of, the nature of our psyche, the nature of what we are as designer, culture, let's say something like the ordered patterns of construction of our time that we meet and must meet. We must meet them. Yeah. Okay, well, perhaps now then, if you're interested, we can have a bit of a dialogue. You can ask any questions. I'd love to hear from you guys. Thank you so much for listening. I hope that was interesting, at least to some degree. So there you go.
Yeah, I just want to clarify when you're talking about loving construction, you're talking about construction as in like the process of design? Or...
Yes, both. Both. I think the process of designing, as well as a care for, when we're designing, we are building, there is an outcome that we do have in mind, right? And so it's a care also for how what we are building is in relation with everything else that we can realize is relevant. And this is the challenging thing, because we do have to move in the world and we do have to act, but to speak of everything seems almost ridiculous. How can we be in relation with everything? That is silly. And yet, we do have to challenge ourselves to, I think, be in relation with more. Certainly, if we're to be visionaries, and we're relating with potentiality, one way or another way, how are we making that discernment? We have to have a sense of a bigger picture in which we participate. That does seem to be the calling, a deep calling of our time, for humanity to come more into awareness of its power, so it can choose with more wisdom. And this is the way it goes, this relationship between power and wisdom, you'll find many people speak about.
Is there a direct relationship between metamodernism? So thank you first of all. There were so many bits and pieces of knowledge that I had to write down and I will have to look up later. It's so much what philosophers are known for, which is great. I also have personal questions later. What made you decide to become a philosopher? But more importantly, is metamodernism in any way, or how can you make the connection between metamodernism or modernism, postmodernism, and loving construction? Where is the connection?
Right. Well,
or is there a connection? Maybe.
Yes. I mean, for me, yes. I certainly don't like to show up as a metamodernist or someone speaking on behalf of that discourse. It's much more that I've come across people engaged in that discourse who I recognize have been in touch with similar currents, deep currents. And I have a lot of appreciation for it. And the link for me is where in the postmodern you have this kind of a more cynical deconstruction. You can deconstruct anybody's position. Well, hang on a second, how are we going to build then? How are we actually going to construct?
When you say cynical, do you mean the questioning of the greater narrative? Is that the cynicism you're talking? Like, okay, we all know, building, in very simple terms, a building needs 4 walls and a roof, right? Mm-hmm. And cynicism would be questioning this. No, I can build a house with 3 walls and half a roof. Or, for me, I understand cynicism in a linguistic term, so I can make a cynic. Probably my example was in a way.
Yes. Well, I don't think there's anything wrong with being capable of taking a cynical perspective. I think the key is if all we are is cynics in every decision we make, that doesn't further. It does lead to a profound kind of, in a way, it's a kind of reductionist method of meeting the world, which is interesting because, of course, postmodernism in part is a bit of a reaction to a reductive thinking.
Yeah.
So one of the things you find in, I think, postmodernism is that because there isn't, there's so many psychological aspects to bring in as well, right? But because there isn't, it's hard to even say basis. Let's say basis for the time being, because there isn't a basis to engage in loving construction. There is nowhere to go apart from being unconsciously led by one's desire that one is not capable of bringing into question. It's partly for this reason. I think that, for many reasons, there is a profound, let's say, there's an important virtue of compassion that recognizes historical injustices and recognizes dynamics between the oppressor and the oppressed. I think what seems to be the case in the context of the postmodern mind, in the context of the postmodern response, only tends towards inverting that dynamic. We can't see beyond oppressor-oppressed. And so we have to sort of counteract things, counteract historical balances, but we're still going to play within the context of oppressor and oppressed. It's quite difficult to come into awareness of and process with a kind of building, a kind of deep ecological relationship, a real participation together that aspires or can hold itself to a process of transformation that can, on the one hand, be with patterns of intelligibility and question them, right? Bring a certain cynicism to it. It's like a sincere irony is the sentiment of metamodernism. It's this capacity to oscillate between the two that they point to. I'm slightly more towards the side of, I think actually we need to, I don't know about this sincerity irony thing. I think in some important sense I'm maybe even in the world of mysticism you have this notion of the cosmic giggle, that in some sense in truly encountering the greater than, one does again encounter a sort of deep hilarity, let's say, in the relationship we have with void. But But nevertheless, I find that life returns. I find that breath returns until it doesn't, and there is something to affirm. And in our deep participation in the nature of what we are is contact with intelligibility, is capacity to come into coherence, is capacity to build together, is capacity to affirm, is capacity to love, is capacity to engage in loving transformation, of which I would see loving construction as being sort of, let's say, one kind of phase, and then there's a sort of a dissolution aspect, and it's ongoing relationship between them, where we can't lose the capacity to come into question, because what we see, take any sort of institution really, but any sort of religious structure that comes into, maybe in one sense it wishes to deeply honor, spirit, can provide a home for it in some beautiful sense, can provide wonderful experiences for people, but it seems to reach a point where now it begins to constrict it, now begins to disgrace it, can only be who you are in this particular way, only this particular way. And the human spirit, the spirit, let's say, of life, spirit as such is now overly constricted, and so we want to be very wary of how it is that what we build to protect something eventually comes to bar its progression into the realization of its potential. And so this relationship between, construction and dissolution is very important, and so that's why loving there, and if we mean by loving, again, it doesn't mean many things by loving, but certainly a deep affirmation, a holding on, and at the same time an openness to letting go. We think about parents letting their children become who they are, but at the same time having to, hold on and to affirm the possibility of what they can be before the child can even be quite aware of that as well, because there is something to elderhood, there is something to maturation, and we do need to encounter others who can open some way into wisdom for us. This is very, very helpful. So, yes, I don't know, maybe that partially answers it. It's certainly not to do away with cynicism. The loving construction for me is just a turn towards how do we build with each other, what can we turn to that can allow us to re-energize and recreate understanding with each other. And there's a lot we can recognize there, but we want to do so without relying on or becoming trapped in like an overly reductive saying of too much reductionism over here, or too much holding on to some absolute way of knowing that precludes or sort of forecloses or denies the reality of our coming into relationship with ourselves and each other, right, as well. So it's a deeply transformational thing to be in relationship with the inquiry for truth itself. It shapes us, there's always a greater than. Yeah.
So sorry, I don't want to take it time. Loving construction is very human-centered, right, in a way?
I would say no, but I can understand how it could be seen that way. We know we love other things, right? I mean, people love their pets and what have you as well, and people can love. I mean, people have.
It always includes us, right? We cannot assume that a building loves a street.
Right. Oh, so yes, interesting. So, I mean, it's an interesting one. I've never quite thought about that. But there's some people who would make the recognition that for molecules, and I'm not the best chemist, hey, I'm like the worst chemist, all right. But I do know that there is a certain relationship that constituent elements of a cell come together and make whole the cell. The cell is participating in something yet broader. And so we could say it seems to be, you could make at least poetically, that these sort of emergent or constructed layers of complexity transcend and include, this is what the integralists will speak about, in that sense they kind of love that which comprises them, right? It's not an annihilation of them in the sense of what the philosopher O.G. Rose calls a self-effacement, but there's, in some sense, a negation of how they're functioning as a sort of isolated or like separate part, and an inclusion in something that is now capable of making whole. And so we're comprised of this, of many, many different subsystems that make whole, are involved in a whole making, what we, can label as something like human. But it's a processual thing. Human is something in becoming. And so I am probably slightly more, it's interesting. I'm certainly not here to profess on such things, but for me, there is a deep mystery, an affirmative mystery, like a living mystery of a continuity inherent in the patterns of all creation. Maybe this is a very vague thing to say, but there is a sense in which, we are cosmos playing itself out in a particular kind of way. And if we do not sufficiently love cosmos, we can think about it as the planet, if we do not desire to know it in that mode, well, then perhaps we create the kind of conditions and participate in the superorganism of humanity that is involved in various sort of mass extinction processes, and in many ways sort of comes to destabilize the substrate that it depends on to live. And so, yeah, interesting one. It's, if I look at a beautiful picture, if I look at a beautiful town, or you think about some context of nature, which we don't want to overly romanticize, of course, because, it might look very much like a tree over here loves a bush over there, but in actual fact, if you play that out over 80 years, the tree is taking too much of its light and that bush can no longer live there. So we want to be, for sure, very careful about anthropomorphizing what we mean by love, but at the same time, is there a deeper love we can participate in that goes beyond and draws on something that is before, like an always already, than just the human? And that is the, I wish to be part of, I wish to live, I want to participate in contexts that have been built, in an enthusiasm for creating conversations in mystery, where the mystery speaks to mystery, where we can come to know and appreciate, that. Not as some final thing where it's just completely gamed out, but we found some way to welcome in the many intelligences of ecology into a conversation. We can begin with the art forms of humanity and what it is to create art forms, how music can, I rejected the opportunity for music in this today, like to speak at the same time, but I do think there's something very interesting about what it is to design for the many intelligences of creative expression to contribute, maybe to seek a kind of harmony, but also to play with the dissonance of that which is never quite reached as harmony. But there's this evolving process. We're bringing each other on the cusp of a question, trying to understand not only the nature of the deep story of what it is to be a living and dying being here, but also what could be. What is it to create new stories? What is it to create new stories? We, on the one hand, we're relating with that. There's so much given in us, and yet at the same time, we're incomplete in that sense. There's so much to learn. And so there is a resourcing, there's a sourcing. Where do we source from? And there's also this relationship with potential. And when we're speaking about potential, we're speaking about something that may or may not be, might not come into actuality. And so it's not quite alive or dead yet. It's in a different category altogether. You could say a kind of maybe transcendent category or something like this. And so that's a fascinating thing, and that's partly this mystery of possibility. Can we see what can we do to help us see some potential ways forward for humanity, that which we are, whatever you want to call us at this moment in history. We don't know exactly. We're becoming something else, but we want to participate in what it is to become that something else, to try and become aware of how it is what we're building is affecting us in turn, but also, of course, the broad patterns which comprise us. And what could be more transdisciplinary than that, really? That maybe nothing could be more transdisciplinary. So,
any other questions?
Yeah, I've got one question. Do you think metamodern is the best period, I guess, of what you're saying to be in, or do you think it's too much knowledge and too much technology means that design's actually not better?
well, I mean, one thing I can for sure say about the context of the people who use the term metamodernism and how they're relating with each other is that there's very much an open question about what metamodernism means. In some aspects of metamodernism, they particularly emphasize sort of adult development, the development of identity, let's say, and its capacity to relate with more complex patterns, or not. And some are not so much of a fan of that way of seeing and would prefer to stick maybe a little bit more in considering this relationship between irony and sincerity. There are... if there's something valuable to metamodernism, it's a hopeful thing. It's hopeful. For me, it's a hopeful turn. That's how if there's value in it, that's how I relate to it. If there's vitality in it, then it's an affirmation of a certain kind of hope.
Hope for what?
Hope for I wrote something the other day, and I was seeking to be in relationship with that question of hope. It was a kind of poetic piece, and this is still for me very much a question that I can only meet poetically. Part of how I described it early on in the piece was it's a kind of hope before it knows itself as anything in particular, and it's just a sort of messy is. I think one way we could see that is as a knowing, in the sense of affirmation, that what we essentially are, that what in us has, we can say, evolved, developed, but there's a through line that connects something essential about the nature of what we are with, in many respects, all we could hope to know. Deep prehistory. Many people will disagree with this, of course, in terms of it's a deep question of metaphysics about whether or not, consciousness even is something which is just contingent, and that actually you go back far enough and there's nothing that it was to be like anything at all. There's something just sort of dead, not even dead, right? There's no life then. There's just a something, an objective something, right? As far as I've been able to see, I have not been able to see the sense in that. And as far as I've been able to see, there is what it is to be is in some sense is to affirm some profound continuity of, now we can use a number of different words. Some might say intelligibility. Some might say I tend to think in terms of orientation. Certainly we can think in terms of quality. I think in some sense it and is have always been together in relationship, and there's a certain quality to is and there's a certain quantity to it. And so there is this relationship between quality and quantity. There is this relationship between it and is, that we are, and that we can participate in transformation. And in that sense, we can discern on our way, which is, in some sense, connected to the self-same process that has always been. And so the hope would be that it's possible to build in a way such that the construction is worthy of being known as loving. And that in that sense, we can participate in the process of loving transformation. Is how I language poetically, in some sense, that. But that you won't find sort of discourse about. What do we mean by loving transformation? I'm not appealing to any particular discursive context here. I can just meet you as an alchemical ingredient in the mix and say, and just continue to talk about it, you know what I mean? And to live and to do and to try and build things like all of you guys. But, there's a lot of chaos in some sense. There's a lot of uncertainty, obviously, and there's an awful lot of, I think, like a deep kind of immaturity in the context of human culture in relation to deep questions of who we are and what we're doing. There's a lot of exploitation. This has always been the case, but there's also been a lot of muddling through and a lot of deep care as well. A lot of deep care. I heard the other day a nice triple in terms of, there's a philosopher named Forrest Landry was speaking about transaction, power, and care. There's different kinds of exchange. Certainly a lot of transactionary exchange, a lot of powerful exchange. Maybe we want to aspire to a kind of wisdom about how our caring for ourselves and each other can remain true to some deep sense of care, while at the same time not succumbing to a naivety with respect to what it is to relate in a world of power and the necessity of transaction. Now, what do those terms mean? We could spend some time picking those things apart. In some sense, I hope it doesn't really matter to me, because these are just terms. But I will say that, I hope that metamodernism is fundamentally an orientation of care, and that it holds to an integrity of belief that it's possible to care in this life, and for that care to be powerful enough, to fulfill its promise.
Could you say with metamodernism, it's to understand the patterns, care for the patterns, so we can love and construct into new patterns or transform those patterns that we exist in?
Yes. Yeah, I think so, absolutely.
Maybe that's the hope.
Yes. Yeah, beautiful. Awesome, guys. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks, Tim.
Thank you.
Awesome.
Thank you. Lot there. Pretty much everything we're learning for the next week, you've done multiple different, pretty much touched on a lot of them, which is awesome. And we'll unpack a lot of that stuff as well. It's a lot.
Yes.
A lot. And sometimes can be overwhelming, but we will unpack a lot of that stuff during this week, and then moving on to trying to apply some of that stuff. So.
Yes. Thank you. Yeah, and let me just say as well that I do, a part of my work in the world is to actively create contexts in which people can come into conversation with each other to relate with this. Not relate in the sense of me, this is the first time, maybe ever, I've spoken for so long in a position where people are listening to me like this, okay? So that's very unusual for me, and mainly the contexts I'm creating are ones in which it's much more, we're meeting each other precisely, where we are. And so I run monthly events and what have you in Brunswick, and they're about bringing people together for conversation and bring different, the next one will be bringing a bishop Anglican Church, as well as a Zen Roshi, and hopefully, maybe someone from a Sufist, and bring those together for conversation. And there's a whole evening of sort of community, people speaking to each other and different things. So if you want to, I don't like to say things and not leave open ways to continue to be in relationship in some form, in that sense of building a relational field together. And that's very much what I'm here in the interest of doing as well. I'm looking forward to conversations we have next as well. So yeah, I don't know if one of the places you can find me is at a website called voicecraft.io. There's some podcasts I've had with many of the people I've even referenced here. So if any of these concepts are interesting, there's like plenty of stuff to check out. And Voicecraft with a voicecraft.io, and that's somewhere you can check it out if it's interesting to you. But yeah.